Ever wondered what life was truly like behind the gilded doors of Europe's longest reigning empire? Forget everything you think you know about fancy dinners and elegant balls. The Habsburg court was a place where ordinary human behavior was twisted into something almost unrecognizable. Here, even simple actions like eating a meal or getting out of bed became performances governed by rules so strange they defy belief. When an emperor died, his body was not simply laid to rest. Parts of him went to 3 different places. When you ate with the royal family, you might be the only one allowed to chew. Every smile, every glance, every step was dictated by ancient ironclad tradition. For centuries, generation after generation of Habsburg, royals and their courtiers lived under a code of conduct that would make your head spin. Get ready to peel back the layers of pomp and uncover the truly bizarre daily realities of a world that existed just a few hundred years ago. Number 10. The Emperor's Daily Schedule. A clockwork existence. The sun might have been just peeking over the Baroque rooftops of Vienna, casting long shadows across the Hofburg Palace, but for the Emperor, the day was not just beginning. It was already in full swing, following a rhythm set not by personal preference or the demands of the moment, but by centuries of unyielding tradition. The Habsburg Emperor, from the moment he opened his eyes, was a prisoner of the clock, a living part of a vast, intricate machine that ran on protocol. Take Emperor Franz Joseph I, for instance, whose reign stretched for an incredible 68 years, from 1848 to 1916. His daily schedule was a marvel of precision, a testament to a life lived under constant scrutiny and rigid expectation. Every minute was accounted for, every transition a carefully orchestrated dance. He would rise at an ungodly hour, usually around 3 o'clock in the morning. This wasn't a choice, it was a deeply ingrained habit, a continuation of a protocol that emphasized early rising as a sign of diligence and piety. His valet, a man who knew the emperor's habits better than anyone, would be waiting, prepared to assist in the precise ritual of dressing. Every button, every fold of fabric, every element of his simple military uniform was put in place with silent efficiency. Historical records from the imperial archives detail the exact sequence. First, the undergarments, then the trousers, the tunic, the boots. No personal flourishes, no deviations. The emperor was not dressing himself, he was being dressed for his role. After dressing, the emperor's first official act of the day, usually around 4 o'clock, was to attend mass in his private chapel within the Hofburg. This was not a quiet, reflective moment for personal prayer. It was another scheduled event attended by a select few high-ranking courtiers and members of the clergy. The chapel itself, while intimate compared to the grand St. Stephen's Cathedral, was still a formal setting. The emperor would kneel in a specific pew, in a specific posture for the entirety of the service. His piety was not just a personal virtue. It was a public performance, a cornerstone of his claim to divine right. Court diarists from the period meticulously noted the emperor's attendance, never missing a detail of his unwavering dedication to this morning ritual. Breakfast followed Mass, and this too was far from a relaxed affair. Franz Joseph's breakfast was famously Spartan. A single cup of black coffee, often sweetened with a little milk, and a simple bread roll. This meal was taken alone. A stark contrast to the grand public dinners later in the day. The solitude of breakfast was perhaps the only moment of true personal space the emperor might experience. Yet even this was dictated by time. It was a rapid consumption designed to fuel him for the long day ahead, not to be savored. The silver tray, the precise placement of the cup and roll, the quiet removal of the dishes, all were part of a seamless, unspoken routine. By 5 o'clock, the emperor would typically be at his desk ready to begin his work. The sheer volume of paperwork that crossed his desk daily was staggering. Petitions, reports from ministers, diplomatic correspondence, military dispatches, all required his personal attention, his signature, his marginal notes. He did not delegate the initial review of documents to assistants. Every piece of paper related to the administration of his vast empire passed through his hands. Court secretaries and adjutants would enter his study at precisely appointed times, presenting documents in a preordained order, standing silently as the emperor worked. They would respond only when spoken to, keeping their answers concise and to the point. The atmosphere in the study was one of hushed efficiency, broken only by the scratching of the emperor's pen or the rustle of papers. Historical accounts mention that even during times of war or national crisis, the meticulous schedule of document review remained largely unchanged. The first official audiences of the day would commence around 9 or 10 in the morning. These were not casual meetings. Each audience was assigned a specific time slot, sometimes as short as 5 or 10 minutes, and the sequence was rigidly adhered to. Ministers, generals, foreign ambassadors, even private citizens with petitions would wait their turn in an antechamber, their anxiety palpable. When their name was called, they would enter the emperor's study, follow precise bowing protocols, and present their case or report with utmost brevity and deference. The emperor would listen, occasionally interjecting with a question, and then offer a decision or a directive. There was no room for lengthy discussions or informal chat. The moment the allotted time was up, the next person was ushered in. Memoirs of various officials describe the intense pressure of these brief encounters, where every word had to count, the rigidity extended to his exercise. Franz Joseph, known for his love of hunting, would often incorporate a shooting session into his morning. But even this leisure activity was structured. It wasn't a spontaneous trip into the woods. It was a planned event, often involving staged hunts where animals were driven into specific areas for the emperor to shoot. The type of game, the number of shots, and the duration of the hunt were all carefully managed, ensuring he got his prescribed amount of fresh air and physical activity without disrupting the overarching schedule. The attendants who accompanied him understood their roles implicitly, ensuring the smooth execution of this recreational protocol. Lunch was typically a less formal meal than dinner, but still governed by time. It might be taken with a few family members, but even then conversation was often limited and subdued. Afternoon hours were again dedicated to administrative work, more audiences, and sometimes reviewing military parades or public appearances that were themselves timed to the minute. If the emperor was to visit a hospital or inspect a new public work, the route, the duration, and the precise moment of his arrival and departure were all choreographed days in advance. Vienna's city officials and military commanders would rehearse the entire sequence to ensure flawless execution. Dinner, the main meal of the day, was another public performance. It would be served at a precise hour, often 7 o'clock in the evening, and was a multi-course affair. But even here, the emperor's personal preferences were secondary to the protocol. He ate quickly, often finishing several courses before others had barely started. The meal was typically silent or consisted of very constrained conversation, a further testament to the formality that pervaded even moments of supposed relaxation. The elaborate array of dishes, the liveried servants, the specific seating arrangements, all contributed to the theatrical nature of the imperial dinner. The evening hours were brief. After dinner, there might be a short period for reviewing more documents, attending a prearranged performance at the court theater, or receiving very high-ranking dignitaries. But by 9 o'clock, or sometimes even earlier, the emperor would prepare for bed. The process of disrobing was as formal as the dressing, again aided by his valet. The day ended as it began, not with personal choice, but with the dictates of a fixed timetable. Sleep was not simply a necessity. It was a scheduled event, preparing the emperor for another identical cycle of duty. The constant adherence to this unyielding schedule meant that the emperor's life had little room for spontaneity or personal whims. Illness, major political events, or even family tragedies, but the underlying framework remained rock solid. It was a life lived by the clock, a testament to the belief that order, predictability, and unwavering adherence to tradition were the pillars of imperial rule. Every minute of the emperor's day was a symbol of the empire's stability, a living embodiment of the vast, intricate machine that was the Habsburg monarchy. He was not just the ruler, He was the primary cog in the great imperial clockwork. Number 9. The Spanish etiquette. A stiff and silent court. Imagine walking into a room where every glance, every gesture, every whisper was preordained, where silence often spoke louder than words, and where even a misplaced smile could be a social disaster. This was the reality of the Habsburg court for centuries, a world dominated by the severe and unyielding rules of Spanish etiquette, imported with the arrival of Spanish brides and officials, particularly during the reign of Emperor Ferdinand I in the 16th century, and solidified by his successors. This code transformed the vibrant, more boisterous Austrian court into a place of rigid solemnity. It was not just a set of manners, it was a philosophy, a tool of power, and a suffocating blanket that wrapped around every member of the imperial household. The etiquette espagnole, as it was known, was born in the highly formal court of the Spanish Habsburgs, where the monarch was viewed as a semi-divine figure, far removed from ordinary mortals. When branches of the family intermarried and power shifted, these rules traveled with them. By the time it was firmly established in Vienna, it dictated everything from how you walked down a corridor to how you addressed the emperor. The primary goal was to emphasize the majesty, dignity, and absolute authority of the sovereign, creating an aura of untouchable grandeur. This meant minimizing casual interaction, discouraging familiarity, and enforcing a strict hierarchy through physical separation and ritualized movement. Take, for instance, the concept of gravity or gravitas. A true courtier was expected to maintain a serious, almost somber expression at all times. Laughter, especially loud or spontaneous laughter, was considered undignified and highly inappropriate in the presence of the emperor or empress. Smiling too broadly could be seen as disrespectful or frivolous. Portraits from the era often show the Habsburgs and their courtiers with stern, unsmiling faces, reflecting this deeply ingrained cultural norm. These weren't just artistic conventions, they were visual documents of a society where emotional restraint was a virtue. Court memoirs from figures like Count Metternich or various ladies-in-waiting often describe this stifling atmosphere where wit and humor, intellectual and tastefully veiled. In the presence of the emperor, courtiers were expected to speak only when spoken to, and their responses had to be brief, respectful, and direct. Engaging the emperor in lengthy discourse, offering unsolicited opinions, or attempting to steer the conversation was unthinkable. Even amongst themselves, courtiers often spoke in hushed tones, using formal address and avoiding topics that might be considered too personal or controversial. The silence of the court became a defining characteristic, often remarked upon by foreign visitors who were accustomed to more lively European courts. One diplomat from France, visiting in the 17th century, famously described the Vienna court as a place of statues. So still and reserved were its inhabitants. Movement within the palace was also strictly controlled. There were specific pathways and staircases designated for different ranks of nobility and staff. Commoners, even high-ranking visitors, were restricted to certain areas. When walking through the imperial apartments, courtiers were expected to move with a measured, deliberate pace, never rushing or exhibiting undue haste. Running, or even brisk walking, was an unthinkable breach of decorum. If the emperor was present, all movement had to cease, and deep bows or curtsies were expected. Historical descriptions of grand court ceremonies, such as the levee or coucher, the emperor's dressing and undressing rituals, emphasized the almost ballet precision of the courtier's movements, each person knowing their exact place and time to step forward or retreat. Seating arrangements were another intricate web of rules. Only the emperor and empress were allowed to sit on thrones, and even the empress's throne had to be slightly lower and less ornate than the emperor's, symbolizing his ultimate authority. Duchesses and certain high-ranking princesses might be granted the privilege of a stool without a back known as a tabouret in the presence of the empress. but never a chair with arms. All other courtiers, regardless of their noble rank, were expected to stand in the presence of the imperial couple. This meant enduring long ceremonies or receptions on their feet, sometimes for hours. The court painter Peter Paul Rubens, when commissioned to depict members of the imperial family, meticulously rendered the varying seating types. Providing a visual record of this rigid hierarchy, even the simple act of eating was transformed by Spanish etiquette. Imperial meals were not communal affairs in the modern sense. The emperor often ate alone, or with only the highest-ranking family members present, in a very public setting known as the Tafelzimmer dining room. Courtiers and dignitaries, if allowed to attend, would often stand and watch the emperor eat, never daring to touch their own food until a specific signal was given. If at all, the emperor ate quickly, and as soon as he finished, the meal was effectively over for everyone. The swiftness of his consumption was a hallmark of the court, leaving many guests bewildered or hungry. The famous Spanish protocol of serving dishes cold was sometimes adopted as the emphasis was on ceremony and display rather than culinary enjoyment. The dress code, while an independent protocol in itself, was deeply influenced by Spanish etiquette. The preference for dark, somber colors, particularly black, the Schwarzmandel, reflected the Spanish emphasis on austerity, piety, and an almost melancholic dignity. Luxurious fabrics and elaborate ornamentation were reserved for specific ceremonial occasions, and even then they had to conform to strict patterns. Flashy, individualistic displays of wealth were frowned upon. The very cut of the clothing was often stiff and restrictive, mirroring the rigid posture and limited movement expected of courtiers. Breaking these rules, even inadvertently, could have severe consequences. A foreign ambassador who, unaware of the strict codes, might have approached the emperor too closely, or spoken out of turn, could find himself quickly ushered out, and his diplomatic mission might suffer irreparable damage. Courtiers who showed too much familiarity or failed to observe the minute details of bowing or addressing protocol could face social ostracism, loss of imperial favor, or even banishment from court. There are historical accounts of individuals being publicly humiliated for minor infractions, serving as stark reminders to others. The Spanish etiquette began to gradually relax in the 18th century, particularly under the reign of Emperor Joseph II, who, influenced by the Enlightenment, found many of the old rules archaic and stifling. He tried to introduce more informality, opening up parts of the palace and even walking the streets of Vienna like an ordinary citizen. However, the deeply ingrained traditions were slow to die. Even into the reign of Franz Joseph I in the 19th and early 20th centuries, echoes of the Spanish etiquette persisted, particularly in the solemnity and the almost reverential distance maintained between the monarch and his subjects. The rigid silence, the measured movements, and the unsmiling faces remained a lingering testament to a time when dignity was paramount and the emperor was truly a distant, almost sacred figure. This wasn't just old-fashioned. It was a way of life designed to reinforce power, elevate the monarch, and keep everyone else firmly in their prescribed place. Number 8. The education of royal children, a curriculum of isolation. Growing up as a Habsburg archduke or archduchess was anything but a normal childhood. While other children might play freely in gardens or learn alongside their peers, a royal Habsburg child was born into a gilded cage, their lives dictated by a curriculum of isolation and duty from their earliest years. Their education was not designed to foster individual talent or free thought, but to sculpt them into perfect, dutiful future rulers or valuable diplomatic assets through marriage. It was a rigorous, often joyless path, separating them not just from commoners, but often from their own siblings and even their parents. The moment a royal child was old enough to leave the nursery, typically around the age of 6 or 7, their formal education began. They were immediately separated from their younger siblings and placed under the strict supervision of a governor for boys or a governess for girls. These individuals were chosen not for their warmth or nurturing qualities, but for their impeccable lineage, their strict adherence to court protocol, and their unwavering loyalty to the crown. Their primary role was to instill discipline, enforce the complex etiquette of the court, and oversee a demanding academic schedule. The personal memoirs of various Habsburg children often hint at the emotional distance between them and their primary condivers, who were more like drill sergeants than parental figures. The curriculum itself was incredibly comprehensive and intensely demanding. For boys, the focus was on preparing them for the weighty responsibilities of governance and military command. They would spend hours each day studying multiple languages, often including Latin, German, French, and Italian. Mathematics, history, geography, and political science were core subjects, taught with an emphasis on statecraft and the intricacies of European diplomacy. Military strategy and horsemanship were also paramount, with lessons conducted by experienced generals and riding masters. Archduke Franz Ferdinand the Heir, whose assassination sparked World War I, was known to have been subjected to an especially intense military education from a young age, complete with simulated battle exercises and rigorous physical training. Girls, while not destined for the throne, in the same way received an equally demanding, though different, education. Their primary role was to be suitable wives for European monarchs or high-ranking nobles, thus cementing political alliances. They learned multiple languages, focusing on those spoken in potential marriage courts. History and geography were taught from a perspective that emphasized the interconnectedness of royal houses. Drawing, music, dancing, and needlework were considered essential accomplishments for a cultured princess, often consuming hours of their day. They also received extensive religious instruction, emphasizing piety and moral rectitude. Empress Elizabeth, famed for her beauty and tragic life, was known to have been a gifted equestrian and poet. Skills honed during her structured childhood lessons, though she often chafed against the rigid academic expectation. What truly set this education apart was the profound isolation it entailed. Royal children rarely interacted with anyone outside their immediate circle of tutors and attendants. Playmates were carefully selected if they existed at all, often being children of high-ranking noble families whose character was meticulously vetted. Spontaneous play or unscripted interaction was rare. Lessons were often conducted one-on-one in designated schoolrooms within the palace, far removed from the bustling life of the court. When a child was deemed old enough to attend official functions, they would do so under the watchful eyes of their governess or governor, their behavior strictly monitored. Any lapse in decorum, any childish outburst, was swiftly corrected. Family interaction itself was highly formalized. Time spent with parents, the emperor and empress, was usually limited to specific, scheduled audiences or formal meals. These were not opportunities for warm, casual conversation. Children were expected to bow or curtsy deeply, address their parents with formal titles, and speak only when spoken to. Physical affection was rare, and public displays of emotion were strictly forbidden. Empress Maria Theresa, despite being a loving mother to her 16 children, still maintained a rigorous formality in her interactions with them, believing it was essential for their development as future rulers. Her children's diaries and letters often reveal a yearning for more parental attention, a common theme among royal offspring. The physical environment reinforced this isolation. While they lived in opulent palaces, their quarters were often separate wings, designed to keep them distinct from the adult court. Gardens might be private walled-off spaces where they could exercise under supervision, never truly experiencing the freedom of the outside world. Travel was usually for official purposes or summer retreats to specific imperial residences, always accompanied by a vast retinue of staff and tutors. The children saw the world through the lens of protocol, their experiences carefully filtered and controlled. Historical accounts of Archduke Rudolf, Franz Joseph's only son, describe him as a highly intelligent but often lonely child, immersed in his studies, but starved of genuine companionship. Even illnesses or personal challenges were handled within the confines of this structured environment. A royal child suffering from a fever would be attended by court physicians, but the routines of hygiene and rest were still strictly dictated by protocol. Emotional struggles, as documented in the private writings of some Habsburgs, were rarely openly discussed or addressed with empathy. Instead, the emphasis was on stoicism and duty, teaching the child to suppress personal feelings for the sake of the imperial role. The famous Habsburg jaw, a prominent genetic feature, sometimes led to difficulties in speech or eating for some members of the family, and children with this trait would often undergo painful and prolonged orthodontic treatments, further intensifying their childhood struggles. The aim of this rigorous and isolated education was to produce individuals who were utterly devoted to the dynasty, deeply steeped in its traditions, and fully capable of performing the demanding role expected of them. There was little room for individual expression or deviation from the preordained path. The system produced highly educated, multilingual, and politically astute individuals, but it often came at a profound personal cost, leaving them emotionally stunted, deeply reserved, and ill-equipped for the complexities of personal relationships. Outside the formal strictures of court, the legacy of this isolation can be seen in the often melancholy personal lives of many Habsburgs, from the reclusive Emperor Ferdinand I to the tragic Empress Elizabeth, who spent much of her life trying to escape the confines of the world into which she was born. Their education prepared them for a throne, but not necessarily for a life. Number 7. The imperial procession. Right of way no matter what. Imagine the bustling streets of 18th century Vienna, a city alive with vendors, carriages, and pedestrians. Suddenly a hush falls. A murmur ripples through the crowd, and people begin to press themselves against walls, drawing their children close. A distinct cry rings out, "Platz!" This was the signal that the imperial procession was approaching. And when the emperor or empress was on the move, every other person, vehicle, and even animal had to yield immediately. And completely. This wasn't just a courtesy. It was an absolute rule of the Habsburg Empire. A visual declaration of supreme authority that brooked no challenge, endured no delay, and tolerated no obstruction. The imperial procession was far more than a simple journey from one palace to another. It was a carefully choreographed spectacle, a moving symbol of imperial power and majesty. Whether the emperor was traveling a short distance from the Hofburg to Schönbrunn Palace, or embarking on a longer journey to a hunting lodge or a provincial capital, the entire operation was planned with meticulous precision. Weeks, sometimes months in advance, the route would be scouted, potential obstacles removed, and local authorities notified of the exact time and date of the imperial passage. The procession itself was an impressive display of wealth and hierarchy. At its head would be mounted outriders, their uniforms gleaming, their horses prancing, clearing the path with their urgent cries, and sometimes physical intervention. These were followed by various detachments of imperial guards, cavalry units, and footmen, all arrayed in their finest livery. Then came the imperial carriages themselves. The emperor's state coach was a magnificent gilded vehicle, often adorned with elaborate carvings and imperial crests, pulled by a team of perfectly matched horses, usually 8 or 12, their harnesses glittering. These horses were specially bred and trained for their role. Selected for their beauty, strength, and steady temperament, the coaches were typically glass-sided, allowing the populace a glimpse of the emperor or empress within, but also serving as a stark reminder of their elevated status, a viewing window into power. Behind the emperor's coach followed other carriages carrying high-ranking members of the imperial family, senior courtiers, ministers, and ladies-in-waiting, all arranged according to a strict order of precedence. The further back you were in the procession, the lower your rank. Even the number of horses pulling each carriage was a sign of status. The emperor's 8 or 12, then perhaps 6 for archdukes, 4 for high nobility, and so on. A vast retinue of servants, footmen, and additional guards would bring up the rear, creating a moving column that could stretch for hundreds of meters, sometimes even a kilometer or more. Historical records from the Habsburg stables detailed the precise allocation of horses and carriages for each type of imperial journey, a testament to the logistical complexity of these movements. The rule of right of way meant exactly that. If the emperor's procession encountered anything in its path, another carriage, a market stall, a flock of sheep, or even a group of people, that obstruction had to vanish instantly. There was no negotiation, no yielding on the part of the imperial entourage. Merchants had to quickly dismantle their stalls and clear their wares. Other carriages had to pull over immediately, often to the very edge of the road, and their occupants were expected to dismount and stand respectfully until the entire procession had passed. Pedestrians had to move onto sidewalks or into doorways, bowing deeply or curtsying as the imperial carriages rolled by. There are anecdotes from the 18th century of carts being unceremoniously pushed aside or goods scattered if their owners were not quick enough to comply. Foreign ambassadors, even those from powerful nations, were not exempt from this rule. While they might enjoy certain diplomatic courtesies in other settings, in the face of an imperial procession, they too had to yield. A famous incident in 1709 involved the French ambassador who, finding himself on a narrow street just as the emperor's carriage approached, was forced to have his own coachman back his carriage into a side alley to avoid blocking the imperial passage. Such occurrences served as subtle but potent reminders of the Habsburgs' supreme authority. Within their own domains, the journey was often punctuated by fixed stopping points. If the procession was traveling a longer distance, fresh horses would be waiting at prearranged stations, allowing for a swift changeover without delaying the emperor. These stations were often grand imperial coaching inns, or specially constructed roadside lodges, meticulously prepared for the emperor's brief stop. Even the peasants and villagers along the route were expected to show deference. They would line the roadsides, often kneeling or bowing, as the imperial grandeur swept past them. A fleeting but powerful moment of connection between the remote sovereign and his people. The very act of watching the emperor pass was considered a privilege, a brief glimpse into a world of unimaginable power and luxury. The emperor himself, inside the coach, was usually impassive, acknowledging the crowds with a slight nod or a wave, maintaining the dignified distance expected of his position. Empress Elizabeth during her later years often used these processions as an opportunity to escape the confines of court life, enjoying the fresh air and the sight of the countryside, though always within the strictures of her public role. Yet even for her, the freedom was superficial, as every detail of the journey was carefully controlled. The right-of-way was not merely about practical logistics, it was a deeply symbolic act. It visually represented the emperor's absolute sovereignty over his lands and his people. His progress was unimpeded because his authority was unimpeachable. It reinforced the idea that the emperor's time, his presence, and his movement were of paramount importance, superseding all other concerns. The entire city, indeed the entire empire, had to adjust its rhythm to that of the imperial household. This protocol was a public theater of power played out on the streets and roads of the empire, reminding everyone who held ultimate sway a stark and undeniable declaration of "Our will be done." Number 6. The death rituals. Organs divided, hearts entrusted. When a Habsburg emperor or empress died, their passing was not a simple matter of burial. It was a complex, centuries-old ritual, a final macabre performance, dictated by strict protocol. Unlike the common practice of burying a body whole, the Habsburgs famously fragmented their deceased, distributing their remains to 3 separate locations across Vienna. This bizarre triple burial, involving the heart, intestines, and body, was a testament to their deep-seated piety, their dynastic pride, and their unique understanding of the afterlife. It was a tradition steeped in medieval mysticism and Baroque grandeur, ensuring that even in death, a Habsburg royal played a very specific fragmented role. The moment a Habsburg sovereign breathed their last, a carefully orchestrated process began. First, a team of highly skilled court physicians and surgeons would be summoned. Their task was not to preserve the body for a single burial, but to prepare it for its dismemberment. The heart would be removed, carefully embalmed, and placed in a special urn. The intestines, along with other internal organs, would also be extracted, similarly preserved, and placed in another separate container. The remainder of the body, including the skeleton and muscle tissue, would then be embalmed for its own distinct journey. This procedure was carried out with solemn precision, usually behind closed doors, attended only by the most trusted court officials and medical personnel. Historical accounts from the 17th and 18th centuries detail the specific techniques used for preservation, often involving a complex array of spices, alcohols, and resins to ensure the longevity of the separated organs. The heart, considered the most noble and spiritual part of the body, was destined for the Augustinian Church, specifically the Loreto Chapel, where it would join the hearts of dozens of other Habsburgs in the Herzgruft, or heart crypt. This chapel was not a grand public space, but a smaller, intimate shrine, reflecting the private, spiritual nature of the heart's repose. Each heart was placed in a silver or gold urn, often bearing the name and reign of the deceased, and arranged meticulously on shelves or within niches. Entering the Herzgruft today is a chilling experience, seeing row upon row of gleaming urns, each holding the very essence of a ruler who once commanded an empire. Emperor Franz Joseph. The first's heart, for example, rests in this very crypt, a final reunion with his ancestors. The symbolism was clear. The heart, the seat of devotion and emotion, belonged to God and to the spiritual legacy of the dynasty. The second destination for the imperial remains was the ducal crypt beneath St. Stephen's Cathedral, Vienna's iconic Gothic masterpiece. Here, the intestines and other visceral organs were interred. These were often placed in copper urns less ornate than the heart urns and stored in a more utilitarian space. The choice of St. Stephen's, the mother church of Vienna, and a symbol of the city's religious heart was deliberate. While the heart went to the Augustinians for personal piety, the organs in St. Stephen's might have represented a more earthly foundational connection to the city and the people over whom the Habsburgs ruled. The crypt is a labyrinthine space, and the sheer number of copper urns, some quite large, is a stark reminder of the sheer volume of Habsburg viscera that accumulated over centuries. Records indicate that the smell of embalming fluid could linger in these crypts for years. Finally, the main body of the deceased, carefully prepared and dressed in their imperial regalia, was laid to rest in the Capuchin crypt, known as the Kaisergruft, or Imperial Crypt. This was the grandest and most public of the three burial sites, serving as the primary mausoleum for the Habsburg dynasty. Here, the ornate sarcophagi, ranging from simple stone slabs to monumental Baroque masterpieces, are arranged in solemn rows. The coffins themselves were often elaborate works of art, made of lead, copper, or silver, sometimes decorated with allegorical figures, imperial symbols, and intricate engravings. The sheer weight and size of some of these coffins are astounding, requiring specialized equipment to move and lower them into place. Empress Maria Theresa's double sarcophagus, shared with her beloved husband, Emperor Francis I, is a particularly striking example, a testament to her power and her enduring love story. The burial ceremony at the Capuchin crypt was a deeply symbolic final act. As the coffin was brought to the crypt entrance, a ritual known as the entry request would take place. The dean of the Capuchin order, standing at the locked crypt door, would demand to know who sought entry. A court official would then announce the full list of titles of the deceased, an impressive litany that could take several minutes to recite. After this grand proclamation, the dean would then ask a poignant question: "We know him not. Who is he?" The official would then reply in a voice stripped of all imperial grandeur, "He is but a mortal and a poor sinner." Only then would the doors swing open, allowing the coffin to be carried inside. This ritual, repeated for centuries, served as a powerful reminder that despite all earthly power and glory, even an emperor was ultimately just a mortal soul before God. It was a moment of enforced humility, a stark contrast to the opulence and power that had defined their lives. This triple burial ritual was unique among European royal houses. It began in the early 17th century with Emperor Ferdinand II, who specified in his will that his heart be interred separately. The practice became standardized and strictly adhered to by almost all subsequent Habsburg rulers until the end of the empire. The reasons for this division are complex, intertwining religious belief, medical practices of the time, and dynastic identity. Some historians suggest it related to the medieval custom of separating organs for easier transport, while others point to a mystical belief that the heart, being pure, belonged closer to God, while the corruptible body and its lower organs needed a different resting place. Whatever the precise origins, it became an unshakable Habsburg tradition, a final act of devotion and a unique signature of their long reign. The continued existence of these three distinct burial sites, all open to public viewing today, provides a powerful and somewhat unsettling insight into the Habsburg mindset. It shows a dynasty that meticulously planned not only their lives, but also their deaths, ensuring their remains were distributed in a manner that reflected their piety, their grandeur, and their eternal connection to the heart of their empire. Even in dissolution, the Habsburgs remained a distinct, unforgettable presence, their fragmented bodies serving as lasting monuments to a truly bizarre and enduring imperial protocol. Number 5. The audience chamber. No direct eye contact, ever. Imagine standing before the most powerful person in your world, someone whose word could change your life, elevate your family, or send you to ruin. Now imagine that when you finally get your moment, you are forbidden from looking them directly in the eyes. This was the precise, unyielding reality for anyone granted an audience with the Habsburg emperor or empress, from the lowliest petitioner to the highest-ranking diplomat. The rules of the audience chamber were absolute. Specific steps, precise bows, and above all, a strict prohibition on direct eye contact. This protocol was not merely a matter of politeness. It was a carefully constructed barrier designed to reinforce the emperor's divine right, emphasize his untouchable status, and ensure that no one, not even for a fleeting moment, could presume equality. The journey to an imperial audience began long before one entered the emperor's study or reception room. The antechambers leading to the imperial presence were themselves a hierarchy. One might pass through several rooms, each filled with progressively higher-ranking courtiers, awaiting their turn. The atmosphere was always one of hushed anticipation, punctuated by the rustle of silk and the soft murmur of low voices. Court officials, often impeccably dressed, chamberlains, or masters of ceremonies, would guide each individual, ensuring they understood and adhered to every minute detail. They were the gatekeepers of imperial dignity, tasked with maintaining the sacred distance between the monarch and everyone else. When one's name was called, the process of entering the imperial presence was a ritual in itself. The individual would enter the room typically through a large ornate door and immediately perform the first of several deep bows or curtsies. For men, this involved bending at the waist, sometimes so low that their forehead almost touched their knees. For women, it was a sweeping curtsy, often involving dipping very low their skirts, rustling around them. The number and depth of bows depended on one's rank and the specific occasion. A minister might perform 3 bows, one upon entering, another midway, and a third just before reaching the emperor. A lower noble might only perform 1 or 2. These bows were not to be rushed. They were deliberate, slow movements, performed with an air of profound reverence. As the individual approached the emperor, who would usually be standing or seated slightly elevated on a small dais, the most crucial rule came into play. The eyes must remain cast downwards. One was expected to look at the floor, or at most at the emperor's feet or hands, never directly into his face. This was a psychological barrier as much as a physical one. It denied the petitioner any sense of personal connection, any hint of shared humanity. The emperor was not a peer. He was a sovereign, a symbol, a near divine authority. And direct eye contact would imply a level of familiarity utterly forbidden. Historical accounts from various diplomats and courtiers describe the intense effort required to maintain this averted gaze, especially when speaking directly to the monarch. When speaking, one's voice was expected to be clear, but not loud, respectful, and free of any emotional inflection. The words chosen were highly formal, often employing archaic forms of address. One could never interrupt the emperor, contradict him, or offer unbidden advice. If the emperor posed a question, the answer was to be concise and direct, without elaboration. Lengthy explanations or personal anecdotes were strictly out of place. The audience was a one-sided affair, primarily for the emperor to receive information or deliver a command. The physical distance maintained was also a part of this protocol. While the exact distance might vary slightly, it was understood that one never approached too closely without express permission. There were invisible lines on the floor of the audience chamber, known only through long tradition, that marked the acceptable proximity for different ranks. Only the highest-ranking court officials, like the chief chamberlain, might be allowed within a few feet. And even then, their movements were measured and their gaze averted. For others, the emperor remained an imposing figure across a carpeted expanse, an almost unreachable presence. The duration of an audience was often incredibly brief, sometimes lasting only a few minutes. As soon as the emperor had given his directive or received the necessary information, the audience was effectively over. The departure process mirrored the entry. Another series of bows or curtsies, performed while backing away slowly from the imperial presence. One did not turn their back on the emperor until they had reached the door, at which point a final, deep bow was performed before exiting the room. This backing away was a physical manifestation of perpetual deference, ensuring that the emperor was always the focus, always the superior. This rigid protocol applied to almost all interactions with the emperor. Even during imperial meals, if courtiers were allowed to stand in the dining hall and observe the emperor eat, their gaze was to be kept away from his face. At court balls or ceremonial events, while the emperor might move through the room making brief remarks to select individuals, the same rules applied. Any conversation would be initiated by him, and direct eye contact was still avoided. This was a continuous performance of power, a constant reinforcement of the emperor's unique status, day in and day out. Even within the imperial family, a degree of this formality could be observed, particularly for younger archdukes and archduchesses, interacting with the reigning emperor or empress. While certainly less rigid than for outsiders. A sense of deference and respect was ingrained from childhood, preparing them for a life within the strictures of the court. Empress Maria Theresa, while famously devoted to her children, still expected a high degree of formality in their public interactions. The consequences of breaching this protocol could range from a silent but chilling disapproval from the emperor, leading to a loss of imperial favor, to outright banishment from court. Foreign diplomats who inadvertently violated these customs might find their missions stalled or their requests denied, as such an oversight could be interpreted as a grave insult to imperial majesty. There are historical anecdotes of foreign envoys used to more informal interactions in their own courts, being utterly bewildered and sometimes humiliated by the severe formality of the Habsburg audience. The no direct eye contact rule, along with the precise bowing and movement, was a cornerstone of the Spanish etiquette that pervaded the Habsburg court. It stripped away individuality, emphasized hierarchy, and created an aura of almost divine remoteness around the monarch. The emperor was not just a man. He was the living embodiment of the empire, and his presence demanded a reverence that transcended normal human interaction. This protocol ensured that every person who came before him understood their place, not just in the room, but in the entire imperial order. It was a powerful, silent declaration of absolute, unquestioned authority, a ritual of humility imposed upon all who entered the emperor's hallowed space. Number 4. The royal bedchamber, a public spectacle. Privacy, as we understand it today, was an alien concept for a Habsburg emperor or empress. From the moment they awoke until they finally retired for the night, their lives were lived in a constant, meticulously choreographed performance. Nowhere was this more evident or perhaps more bizarre than in the ritual of the royal bedchamber. The seemingly intimate acts of waking up, getting dressed, and going to bed were transformed into elaborate public spectacles known as the lever and the coucher, respectively. These were not casual morning routines. They were highly formal court ceremonies attended by dozens of high-ranking nobles designed to showcase the monarch's majesty, reinforce hierarchy, and demonstrate the seamless operation of the imperial court. The lever, or the waking ceremony, was perhaps the most astonishing. Long before dawn, typically around 6 or 7 in the morning, a select group of the highest-ranking courtiers, along with personal attendants, would begin to gather outside the emperor's bedchamber. These included the Grand Chamberlain, the Chief Valet, various lords-in-waiting, and often even high-ranking military officers. Each had a precise role to play, a specific item of clothing to present, or a particular duty to perform in the elaborate ritual of the emperor. The very act of the emperor rising was a public performance, watched by an audience of silent, deferential observers. The doors to the bedchamber would be ceremoniously opened, and the procession of courtiers would enter, bowing deeply as they approached the imperial bed. The emperor, who had likely been awake for some time, perhaps even conducting some initial work, would then awaken for his audience. The chief valet would present the emperor's shirt, which he might slip on under the covers. Then, one by one, different articles of clothing would be brought forward by specific officials. The boots might be presented by a particular lord, the trousers by another, the tunic by a third. Each item was handled with extreme reverence, a symbol of the emperor's body and by extension the state itself. The emperor would then be assisted in dressing his movements precise and economical, while the courtiers watched in solemn silence, their presence a testament to their loyalty and the emperor's supreme status. The entire process could take a significant amount of time, sometimes an hour or more, depending on the complexity of the emperor's attire and the number of dignitaries present. Conversations, if any, were formal and brief, initiated by the emperor himself. It was not a time for personal petitions or informal chat. The lever was about visibility and access, about the privilege of being present at the monarch's most private moment. For courtiers, merely being allowed to stand in the bedchamber during the lever was a mark of immense prestige, a clear signal of their closeness to the imperial person. Memoirs of courtiers from the 17th and 18th centuries often recount the stifling atmosphere of these early morning rituals, where every movement and every breath was carefully measured. The coucher, or the going-to-bed ceremony, was the mirror image of the lever. Equally formal and equally public, as evening drew to a close, often around 9 or 10 o'clock, the same group of high-ranking officials and attendants would gather once more outside the bedchamber. The emperor would return from his final engagements of the day, and the solemn ritual of undressing would commence. Each piece of clothing, from the outer tunic down to the undergarments, would be ceremoniously removed and handed to a specific courtier, who would then pass it to another. In a precise sequence, the chief valet would assist the emperor in his nightclothes, and finally the emperor would retire to bed, usually with a final deep bow from the assembled company. Even the act of sleeping was not entirely private. While the immediate bedchamber might be closed, the adjoining antechambers were often still guarded, and highly trusted officials might even sleep within earshot. The emperor's personal safety and well-being were paramount. But this also meant a perpetual lack of solitude. Emperor Franz Joseph I, in the later years of his reign, preferred a more simplified version of these rituals, but the core elements of public dressing and undressing remained, albeit with fewer attendees. Empress Elizabeth, famously reclusive in her later life, found these public rituals utterly suffocating, often trying to avoid them or minimize their formality. Whenever possible, The significance of these ceremonies went far beyond mere tradition. They served several crucial purposes. Firstly, they were a powerful visual demonstration of the monarch's absolute power and the intricate hierarchy of the court. Every person present, every item handled, every gesture made, reinforced the idea that the emperor was the center of the universe, and everyone else revolved around him. Secondly, they provided unparalleled access to the emperor for high-ranking nobles. Being chosen to attend the lever, or Kauser, was a highly sought-after privilege, a sign of immense imperial favor. It allowed courtiers a chance to be seen by the emperor, even if they could not speak to him directly, and to subtly assert their proximity to power. Thirdly, these ceremonies were a form of political theater. They instilled awe and reverence, not just among those present, but throughout the court and by extension, the empire. The very fact that the emperor's most private moments were public spectacles emphasized his role as a living embodiment of the state. He was not just a man, he was an institution, and even his body was a symbol of imperial majesty. The seamless execution of these complex rituals also demonstrated the efficiency and discipline of the Habsburg court, projecting an image of stability and unwavering order. The origins of these rituals can be traced back to the French court of Louis XIV. The Sun King, whose highly formalized lever and Kauser were the epitome absolute monarchical power. The Habsburgs adopted and adapted these practices, integrating them into their own unique brand of Spanish etiquette, making them perhaps even more solemn and rigid. For centuries, generation after generation of Habsburgs and their courtiers lived out these daily performances, a stark reminder that in the world of imperial power, there was no true private life, only a constant demanding all to be played before a never-ending audience. Number 3, the kissing hand protocol, a hierarchy of humiliation. Imagine a greeting so complex, so layered with rules that it could determine your entire social standing, mark you as favored or forgotten, or even shame you publicly. In the Habsburg court, the simple act of greeting the emperor or empress was transformed into a profound statement of hierarchy and submission. The kissing hand protocol, or handkuss, was far more than a polite gesture. It was a ritualized act of obeisance, a physical manifestation of one's exact position within the rigid imperial structure. From the way you approached to the depth of your bow, to whether your lips actually touched the royal hand or merely hovered above it. Every detail spoke volumes. For courtiers, it was a daily dance of deference, often fraught with anxiety. A public display that could elevate or humiliate. The most basic form of the handkuss involved a deep bow for men, or a sweeping curtsy for women. The individual would approach the emperor, their eyes typically averted or cast downwards, and extend their right hand palm up. The emperor, usually standing or seated on a slightly elevated chair, would then extend his own hand. The supplicant would then take the emperor's hand, briefly lift it towards their lips, and either lightly kiss the back of it, or more commonly simply brush their lips over it without actually making contact. This was the most common form used by most high-ranking nobles and officials. The fleeting nature of the touch, or its deliberate absence, underscored the immense distance between the sovereign and the subject. However, the protocol was far more nuanced than a simple brush of lips. The exact nature of the handkuss depended entirely on the rank and relationship of the individual to the emperor. For the highest-ranking members of the imperial family, such as archdukes and archduchesses, a genuine kiss on the hand might be permitted, a rare sign of familial affection within the formal structure. For foreign royalty, particularly reigning monarchs, the hand kiss might be omitted, entirely replaced by a handshake or a mutual bow, acknowledging a certain level of peer status. But for everyone else, the rules were ironclad and often publicly performed, particularly during court receptions, audiences, and even daily greetings. Consider the hierarchy of touch. The air kiss. For the vast majority of courtiers, especially those of lesser noble rank, the handkuss was an air kiss. The hand would be raised to within an inch or two of the emperor's skin, and the lips would form the shape of a kiss. But no actual contact was made. This subtle distinction was immediately noticeable to everyone present and served as a constant reminder of one's place. Failing to perform the air kiss correctly, or accidentally making contact when one was not permitted, could be a serious social blunder, interpreted as undue familiarity. The light touch. For slightly higher-ranking officials or favored individuals, a very light, almost imperceptible touch of the lips to the back of the hand might be allowed. This was a rare privilege, a subtle mark of imperial favor that could send ripples of envy or speculation through the court. The forehead kiss. In certain very specific circumstances, usually between older respected relatives or for highly distinguished elderly male courtiers, the emperor might offer his forehead for a kiss. This was an even rarer gesture of extreme paternalistic favor and respect, a signal that the recipient was regarded almost as a family elder. The context of the handkuss also played a role. During grand public ceremonies such as New Year's receptions or imperial birthday celebrations, hundreds of courtiers would pass before the emperor and empress, each performing their specific version of the handkuss in rapid succession. The process was a well-oiled machine, guided by masters of ceremonies, who ensured the flow of individuals and the correctness of their bows and gestures. Any hesitation, any deviation from the expected performance would be immediately noted, and could lead to quiet censure or a subtle decline in imperial favor. Memoirs from ladies-in-waiting often describe the intense pressure of these moments, where a single misstep could invite public embarrassment. The handkuss was not merely a passive act for the recipient. The emperor and empress also played their part. They would extend their hand in a specific way, sometimes turning it slightly, indicating whether a touch was permissible or not. A rapid withdrawal of the hand or a slight shift in posture could be a subtle sign of displeasure or a reminder of distance. Empress Elizabeth, especially in her later, more reclusive years, found these constant public interactions and the endless procession of kissing hands incredibly tiresome and often tried to avoid them. Emperor Franz Joseph, by contrast, performed the ritual hundreds of times a day with an almost mechanical precision, a testament to his ingrained sense of duty. The origins of the handkuss are ancient, rooted in feudal traditions of homage and medieval religious practices of kissing. Relics. For the Habsburgs, it was deeply intertwined with the Spanish etiquette that emphasized reverence for the monarch. It served as a powerful daily reinforcement of the social order. By performing the handkuss, a courtier publicly acknowledged the emperor's supreme authority, his own subordinate position, and his unwavering loyalty. It was a physical commitment to the hierarchy, a non-verbal oath of allegiance. The protocol could also be used as a subtle form of punishment or displeasure. If an individual fell out of favor, the emperor might subtly delay extending his hand, or offer it in a way that made a proper handkuss difficult, sending a clear, unspoken message of disapproval. Conversely, a prolonged gaze from the emperor or a slight squeeze of the hand could signal warmth or renewed favor, causing a courtier's spirits to soar. These subtle variations in the ritual were keenly observed and endlessly discussed by the rest of the court. Serving as a barometer of the political climate, ultimately, the kissing hand protocol was a brilliant, if bizarre, mechanism for maintaining control and reinforcing the absolute power of the Habsburg monarch. It transformed a simple greeting into a complex dance of power and submission, where every movement, every gesture, and every missed touch spoke volumes. For those who navigated its intricacies successfully, it was a path to advancement. For those who faltered, it was a constant public reminder of their place within the vast, unyielding hierarchy of the Habsburg court, a daily ritual that subtly but powerfully communicated who held the true reins of power, Number 2. The Schwarzmondel, the color of power and mourning. Step into any painting of the Habsburg court from the 17th or 18th century. Blonde. Color immediately dominates. Black. Not just a sprinkle, but a full whelming sea of it. This wasn't a coincidence or a fleeting fashion trend. It was a deeply ingrained centuries-old protocol known as the Schwarzmondel, or Black Cloak. For much of the Habsburg dynasty's history, particularly from the 16th to the mid-18th century, black was the official, omnipresent color of court dress for both men and women. It was a visual declaration of piety, solemnity, and dynastic power, an austere uniform that paradoxically conveyed immense wealth and gravitas. This unwavering adherence to black was one of the most distinctive and frankly bizarre aspects of life in the imperial court, turning every public gathering into a somber, monochromatic spectacle. The origins of the Schwarzmondel can be traced back to the Spanish Habsburgs, who, influenced by a blend of devout Catholicism and the somber formality of the Burgundian court, adopted black as their preferred color. When Emperor Charles V, a Spanish Habsburg, inherited vast territories, including the Holy Roman Empire, the Spanish influence spread. His son, Philip II of Spain, was famously devout and austere, and his court was a sea of black, emphasizing piety and humility in the face of God, while simultaneously projecting immense authority. When the Austrian Habsburgs began to intermarry extensively with their Spanish cousins, this sartorial preference, along with much of the Spanish etiquette, was firmly transplanted to Vienna. For men, the Schwarzmondel typically consisted of a black doublet, often made as velvet or silk, a black cloak or cape, and black breeches. The only splashes of color might come from the white ruffs or lace collars that framed their faces, or the glint of jeweled sword hilts and order sashes. Even the hats, often broad-brimmed and feathered, were black. The fabric itself, while dark, was often incredibly rich, heavy velvets, lustrous silks, and fine wools, signaling the immense cost of such attire. Gold or silver embroidery, though present, was usually subtle, designed to catch the light rather than create a stark contrast. The overall effect was one of imposing dignity and reserved power. For women, the Schwarzmondel meant black gowns, often with stiff bodices and voluminous skirts. While the general color was black, the fabrics could vary from heavy brocades to lighter silks, and the cut might evolve with fashion trends. However, the overarching rule of black remained. Again, white lace collars, cuffs, and undershirts provided the only stark contrast. Jewelry, though exquisite and abundant, was often worn to complement the black, rather than to overpower it, often featuring pearls, diamonds, or dark gemstones. Hair was often styled simply, sometimes covered with veils or small black caps. The black dress emphasized the modesty and piety expected of noble women, while the richness of the fabric and the quality of the cut simultaneously communicated their immense status. The prevalence of black was not just a fashion choice, it was a profound statement. Piety and humility. In a deeply Catholic empire, black symbolized humility, devoutness, and a rejection of worldly vanity. By dressing in black, the court signaled its devotion to God and its serious approach to life and duty. It evoked the attire of religious orders and conveyed a sense of moral rectitude, solemnity, and seriousness. The color black also projected an air of gravity, seriousness, and permanence. It mirrored the often somber atmosphere of the court, where laughter and frivolity were often frowned upon. It reinforced the notion that the business of empire was a weighty, solemn affair. Mourning. Black was, and still is, the color of mourning. The Habsburg court, particularly after the 30 Years' War and throughout the centuries of constant conflict and dynastic intermarriage, seemed to be in a perpetual state of mourning for various deceased relatives. The Schwarzmandel allowed the court to be in a constant state of respectful remembrance, a subtle nod to the transient nature of life and the continuity of the dynasty. Power and authority. Paradoxically, black also became a symbol of immense power. It was expensive to dye and maintain, especially high-quality black fabrics. The uniformity of the black dress also created a cohesive visual identity for the court, making its members instantly recognizable and projecting an image of unified authority. When a foreign dignitary entered a room filled with hundreds of identically dressed solemn figures, the impression of overwhelming disciplined power was undeniable. Court artists, like the famous Baroque painter Diego Velázquez, documented the monochromatic fashion of the Spanish and Austrian Habsburgs in vivid detail, showing the stark elegance and gravitas imparted by the black attire. His portraits of Philip IV and his court are a master class in rendering the nuances of black fabric. While the Schwarzmandel was the dominant theme, there were slight variations. For grand ceremonial occasions, particularly coronations or specific religious festivals, more colorful, heavily embroidered robes might be worn, but these were the exceptions that proved the rule. During periods of deep mourning, the black might become even more severe, with all forms of ornamentation or contrasting lace removed. Empress Maria Theresa, a pivotal figure in Habsburg history, marked a subtle shift away from the absolute dominance of the Schwarzmandel in the mid-18th century. While black remained a highly respected and frequently worn color, particularly for formal occasions, she began to introduce more variety and lighter colors into court fashion, influenced by emergy, rococo styles from France. Her portraits, especially those from her later life, still often show her in black, but her children and courtiers began to experiment with blues, silvers, and pastels. However, even in the 19th century, under Emperor Franz Joseph, the first black remained a prominent, almost default color for court dress and military uniform, especially for daily wear and formal audiences. Franz Joseph himself was rarely seen out of his austere military uniform, which was primarily black or dark blue, adhering to the tradition of somber dignity. Empress Elizabeth, despite her personal love for vibrant colors and fashion, often wore black for official duties, acknowledging the deep-seated court protocol. The Schwarzmandel was more than just a dress code. It was a visual representation of the Habsburg identity, a centuries-long performance of piety, solemnity, and unwavering authority. It transformed the vibrant human spectrum into a disciplined, monochromatic tableau, a silent but powerful declaration of who they were and how they intended to rule. It was a bizarre and enduring tradition that ensured the Habsburg court, even at its most lavish, always carried an air of serious, unyielding power. Number 1. The imperial meals. Eating alone. Always. Imagine sitting down to a meal, not in the cozy intimacy of a family dinner, but on a grand stage, under the watchful eyes of dozens of silently standing courtiers. Now imagine that the person you're theoretically dining with the emperor eats at a bewildering speed, finishing multiple courses before you've barely begun, forcing the entire meal to end abruptly. This was the bizarre reality of imperial meals at the Habsburg court, particularly for the emperor himself. Far from being a moment of private sustenance, dining was a highly ritualized public performance, a display of power and solitude, where the emperor often ate alone and everyone else simply observed. This protocol was a potent symbol of his elevated status, a constant reminder of the immense distance between the sovereign and his subjects, even during an activity as fundamental as eating. For centuries, the emperor's main meal of the day, usually dinner, was a public spectacle known as the Tafelzimmer, or dining room ceremony. It typically took place in a magnificent hall within the Hofburg or Schönbrunn Palace, adorned with rich tapestries, gilded furniture, and elaborate chandeliers. The table itself was set with the finest imperial porcelain, gleaming silver cutlery, and crystal glasses. But despite the opulent setting, the atmosphere was one of profound formality, not convivial dining. The emperor would enter the dining hall, often accompanied by only the empress or a select few highest-ranking members of the imperial family. He would take his seat at the head of the table. However, unlike a typical family meal, the rest of the table was rarely filled with guests. Instead, along the walls of the dining hall stood rows upon rows of high-ranking courtiers, ministers, foreign ambassadors, and other dignitaries. These individuals were not there to eat. They were there to observe. They stood in silent reverence, their presence a testament to their privilege and the emperor's supreme status. Their eyes were generally fixed straight ahead or slightly averted, never directly on the emperor's face, following the strict rules of the audience chamber. The serving of the meal was a choreographed ballet. Liveried servants, often in specific uniforms denoting their rank, would move with practiced precision. Each course, often numbering 5 or more, would be brought to the table on silver platters, presented to the emperor, and then swiftly removed after he had taken a few bites. The emperor's eating habits were legendary for their speed. Emperor Franz Joseph, the first in particular, was known to consume an entire multi-course meal in under 15 minutes. He ate quickly, efficiently, and with little conversation. His focus was on sustenance and the execution of the protocol, not on culinary enjoyment or social interaction. This rapid consumption had a profound impact on anyone fortunate enough to be seated at the table with him. If the empress or another high-ranking archduke was permitted to dine with the emperor, they faced an impossible dilemma. According to court protocol, no one could continue eating after the emperor had finished. As soon as the emperor laid down his fork or signaled that he was done, all plates were immediately cleared, regardless of whether anyone else had finished their meal. This meant that any dining companion had to eat at an equally frantic pace, or risk having their food removed, almost untouched. Historical anecdotes recount how foreign ambassadors, accustomed to leisurely European meals, would find themselves bewildered and still hungry after these swift imperial repasts, barely having sampled the first course. The conversations during these meals, if they occurred at all, were minimal and highly formal. The emperor might address a question to a seated family member, but extended dialogue was rare. The presence of the standing courtiers, the continuous movement of servants, and the sheer formality of the occasion made true conversation almost impossible. The imperial dining room was, in essence, a silent theater where the emperor was the sole actor, and everyone else was a reverent audience. The custom of the emperor eating alone, or mostly alone, served several purposes: divine, right, and separation. It physically separated the emperor from ordinary mortals, reinforcing his semi-divine status. He was too grand, too important to engage in the mundane act of eating as equals. Public display of power. The meal was a daily public ceremony, tutoring the emperor's wealth, his control over his household, and the unwavering discipline of his court. The sheer number of people involved in serving him and the deference shown was a clear statement of his absolute authority. Security. While seemingly public, the ritualized nature of the meal also offered a degree of control over what the emperor consumed and who came near him. Food tasters and precise serving protocols ensured his safety. Time efficiency. For monarchs like Franz Joseph, whose daily schedule was packed from dawn to dusk, rapid meals ensured minimal interruption to their administrative duties. Eating quickly became a habit, an ingrained part of their efficient existence. This bizarre dining protocol was a hallmark of the Spanish etiquette that infused the Habsburg court. It emphasized dignity, formality, and the paramount importance of the monarch. While other European courts might have more boisterous or conversational meals, the Habsburg Tafelzimmer remained a bastion of solemnity. Emperor Joseph II, in his attempts to modernize and simplify the court in the late 18th century, did try to relax some of these rules occasionally, dining with a more diverse group of individuals, or attempting to prolong the meal for conversation. However, the deeply ingrained traditions were resistant to change, and much of the formality returned after his reign. Even into the 19th and early 20th centuries, Franz Joseph I maintained much of the rigid dining protocol. His meals remained swift, quiet affairs, often with few or no seated companions beyond the empress. His personal simplicity in eating, contrasting with the elaborate ceremony, only added to the unique character of these imperial meals. He ate to live, and his eating was a public performance of his duty, not a private pleasure. The imperial meal, therefore, was not a break in the day, but another act in the continuous drama of imperial life. It was a bizarre, silent feast where the central figure ate with startling speed, and those around him stood in hushed reverence, their own appetites secondary to the grand, unyielding spectacle. It was a daily powerful reminder that in the Habsburg Empire, the emperor truly stood alone, even at his own table.